honored to be here with the home team here at Malaprop. So this is the best bookstore in the country. You know that. Thanks for coming out on a dreary night like tonight. I'm just delighted to be here with Culley and talk about his debut novel, which is kind of a wonderful thing to be out in the world, is with the first novel, Hemlock Hollow. Novelists always hate that little synopsis you have to do for the booksellers in the back of the book. You've written 300 pages or more or something, and someone's telling you, "Wait, can you boil it down for me? What's the elevator pitch? Can you tell me in 30 seconds? So I'll do that for Culley. How's that? So Hemlock Hollow, Carolyn McAllister, an academic archaeologist, is putting together the pieces of a broken life. After a messy divorce and the death of her father, Carolyn returns to the rundown family cabin in the Hickory Nut Gorge, just south of Asheville, just over the mountain here, Intent on reclaiming her roots in the magical Hemlock Hollow, she hires a contractor to rebuild that childhood refuge, but there are secrets to be unearthed here. Her contractor quickly discovers a box, and in this box is the old journal of Carson Quinn, a former inhabitant of this cabin. And Carolyn, Carson is no stranger to Carolyn. She's seen this guy before in her childhood. Was it a dream? Was it a ghost? She does remember a bearded, sorrowful man in a brown suit. And evidently, his brooding spirit forever haunts this particular cabin, this particular neck of the woods that Carolyn finds herself in. Now, the local lore has it that Quinn murdered his own brother Thomas in some sort of tiff over a childhood sweetheart, Miranda. And he lived out his days as a hermit there on this very mountain. So Hemlock Hollow, it's a historical murder mystery and it's a ghost story, and it's a love story. I think David Foster Wallace once said, every love story is a ghost story, which is kind of interesting. So Culley takes us on a twin journey. Carson's youth that we read about as it goes along in his journal, and Caroline's adventures in contemporary Appalachia, trying to find a new life for herself. And so, yes, I said before, this is Culley's debut novel. And like the best of Appalachian literature, from John Ely to Ron Rash to Wiley Cash, Culley gives us readers an unforgettable tale about how we forever haunt the places we love and how they haunt us in return. Hemlock Hollow feels like a real place on a map that's important to both Carson and to Caroline. You certainly take the readers there with your prose. And so rather than me talking about it, if you could read a little bit for us, Colin.
Sure. Thank you for that great summation, Dale. And I'll start with by reading a little just from the very beginning of the novel, so that you'll get a sense of how we get into the book. Let me put on my old man glasses. This is Dale set this up really well, so I don't need any sort of intro here. The box wasn't much to look at. Old and metal, at one point it had probably been gray. Over the years it had oxidized green. There were 3 clasps on the front, now corroded with grit and rust. Micah and his crew had discovered it in the attic and had carted it through the old cabin to the card table we had set up out back. The decades of dirt and dust left a trail through the loft, down the stairs and up the hill, more crumbled onto the tarp I had laid out. My family had owned the cabin for my entire life, and I had never seen this box before. It had been sitting in an attic I didn't know existed, waiting to be found for who knows how long. "What do you say, Caroline?" Micah asked, wiping his brow with a bandana. He tugged at his scraggly beard. "Should we open it?" I pondered whether to toss the box and its mystery contents into the giant waste bin out front, or to open it and take the plunge into a dark past I had spent a lifetime trying to escape. Down the hill, Micah's crew continued with their demolition work, their sledgehammers echoing through the hollow. Up the mountain, a crow called. "Well," Micah asked, "I can get a crowbar." I sighed, my reluctance giving way to curiosity and compulsion. "If you get me a blowtorch and a flathead screwdriver, I can open this. I am an archaeologist after all." "That's so." His eyes widened. He took off his Wilco hat and ran a hand through his untamed hair. "Like Indiana Jones?" Everyone's favorite archaeologist was in no way an archaeologist, but rather than lecture my general contractor, I shook my head. "No, more interpretive than old Indy. Less running from boulders and ghosts, more thinking about the ancient stars and writing about them. You best watch what you say. Opening that box may release the spirit of the hollow. He chuckled, winked, and plunged down the mountain to his old pickup truck. I laughed at his joke, but that was exactly what I was afraid of. The summer I turned 12, Dolores Appleton and Martha Boston, my two best friends, had come up from Greensboro to spend the month of July at the cabin. We all shared a double bed upstairs. Oh, the late night conversations we had. Even now, in middle age, I blush at the suppositions we made about sex and boys and romance. Late one night, Dolores and Martha had dozed off. I knew this because Dolores snored and Martha had the deep breathing of the truly asleep. I woke having to use the bathroom. It was so dark that I couldn't tell if I had opened my eyes or not. I pushed down the covers and tuned my senses to the night. Outside, a breeze rustled the tall hemlocks. A spray of needles and tiny cones skittered down the tin roof. Katydid, so raucous in the early evening, had quieted to a low dirge. Everyone lay fast asleep. Mom and Dad in their bedroom on the main floor. Andrew, my brother, in his bedroom across from mine. The girls in the bed with me. The only bathroom was downstairs. As I steeled myself to climb from the bed, the old stairs creaked as if someone was coming up. I swiveled my head. Another step squeaked, higher, this time closer. I clenched my urgent bladder. The next step had sunk. The next step let out a long and drawn out sigh, as if the climber had sunk a heavy foot slowly. My mind ran through the possibilities. It could be my father, climbing up to check on us. I waited for his balding head to emerge in the stairwell. Another step followed, this time barely perceptible. My heart pounded. A step creaked near the top of the stairs. Maybe it was my mother. As if on cue, everything fell silent, even the katydids. The air stilled. All the hair on my body stood straight. A bone-deep chill chased the covers up my neck. I was overcome with the sense that somebody was in the room with us, somebody who wasn't family, and who wasn't exactly alive. The visage of a bearded, sorrowful man in a brown suit flashed through my mind like an afterimage. Anguish seized me. I'd never felt anything like that. A 12-year-old should never feel such despair. He was standing at the end of the bed. Though I didn't dare look, I knew he was there. I buried my face in my pillow. He moved beside me, his breath heavy in my ear.
Very nice, very nice. It was nice. Culley and I were sort of catching up before we got started here. It's always nice to talk to a fellow novelist, because novel writing is such a strange obsession. Novelists are not born yesterday. Novels aren't written overnight, and it takes a lot of time. So, when did you first start writing this book? How long did it take? Why don't you tell us a little about your writing journey here?
Yeah, so I first started writing this book about 20 years ago. So, I don't want to discourage anyone in the room. I might be starting a novel now. It wasn't straight through. I didn't sit down 20 years ago and put my head down and come up 20 years later and have a finished novel. It was in spurts. It was in the gaps between jobs. It was, in fits and starts. Write a little bit, you look at it, you gain perspective, you come back to it, and then you work on it some more, work on other projects and come back to it. But from the moment that I started to the moment I got a book contract, it's about 20 years.
Cool. So, and I'm always interested in how, what begins, that kind of journey for a novelist. I do remember talking to Ron Rash about, how he comes up with his novels and such. And I think there was sort of a misconception to think that, these writers are sitting there working out this huge plot, and they know what happens at point A, and they know what happens at point Z and all that, and in between or whatever. Ron told me he was driving up the road from Clemson, where he lives, up to Culley, where he teaches. And he had, he's a poet first and foremost, he started that. And he had this image come to mind of a woman, big, handsome woman, blonde-haired woman on horseback. That stuck with him or whatever. And that was Serena. That was where Serena came from. And this basic questions like, who is that woman? What's she doing on that horseback? Why is she so intriguing to me? And so sort of novel. Was there an initial image, or where did Hemlock Hollow, where did this novel start with?
So this novel started when I was about 12 or 13, probably. My family has a cabin over in Bat Cave, And I was fascinated with the prior occupants of this cabin. And probably when I was 12 or so, my father, who's in the audience here, was up cleaning out this attic space that we really didn't know existed. And he started pulling all these artifacts out of this space. And there was bottles and a shoe and a petrified squirrel, and out came this box after the squirrel, of course. And the box contained a series of photos of the folks that had lived in this area, in that cabin prior to us. And I just became fascinated with them and wondered who they were. Later at UNC, I double majored in comparative literature and history, and my history degree got me working in the Southern Historical Collection. And I became fascinated with this primary source research, and I turned that to this area of the Hickory Neck Gorge, and really tried to get a sense of still trying to discern who these people were. And I got a lot of facts and a lot of information, but I couldn't really make sense of it until I fictionalized it. And I created this family, the Quinns, and they pulled me in, and so it was a process that began as a child with this land that I interacted with very much like Caroline does in the book, in terms of going out into it, finding these artifacts and these sites around the gorges and the valleys, and trying to make sense of it all, trying to make sense of how people live.
Well, you were telling me before that you tried writing it. Those early drafts were basically about Carson back in the 1800s, and doing a straight ahead historical novel, which didn't quite seem to work, or you wanted to do something more. Where did Carolyn McAllister come from?
That's a great question. So I wrote this first draft, and it had a beginning, middle, and end. It was fine, but it wasn't really the book that I wanted to write, I realized. And so I set it aside and went back and did more research. And the research led me to the journal. So the journal was written first. It was written separate from Caroline's section. And it was, I had absorbed a lot of this research, and I had, it just sort of, Carson's voice just kind of came out of that, and it just sort of poured onto the page in an almost metaphysical kind of experience. And so I had, at that point, after I had written that, I probably had a 200-page journal. And it was factual. It also contained the characters from the 1880s who are in the book. But it didn't also work. It did not work as a novel. It was just a journal. And so Caroline, about a year or so later, came into the picture. And I can't remember exactly what brought her into it, but I was trying to work with the journal and try to turn it into a novel. And this voice came, and it was Caroline's voice, and and her act of discovery is what I realized I needed to be on the page to bring that journal to life. And so it was this sort of trio of writing projects, really, the original draft and the journal, and then Caroline's section, kind of melding those together became the project at the end of it all.
Well, that's always tricky to do, is you have two storylines going on. You got two first persons, really, a young man and a middle-aged woman, divorcee and that sort of thing. And it is nice how it goes back and forth there. I was curious about, again, you're heavy into the research, you're going into those archives, how hard was that to actually, do the research and actually make all that come alive in the imagination? That's always the hard part. Is, the danger is always trying to stuff too many facts into a fiction.
Exactly. Exactly. At the end of the day, it's a story, right? You want to tell a story, and you want your research to support that, and you don't want your story to be your research. So I think that there's a balancing act between what you know as the author and what the characters know and live, and the story that they tell on the page. And that was always a struggle for me, is there's all this cool stuff that didn't make it into this book. And I'm stuck. I still have that. So it may show up in future books. But you got to be careful about that, because my own fascination with arcane history may not be shared by the reading public.
A lot of it is. I think sometimes I like reading novels, and you do learn cool stuff. You know, cool stuff is always an extra bonus, but besides the story, the characters, the fine writing, all that kind of stuff that we read on the back of the blurbs and that sort of thing. And what's nice is the Quinns, you know, Carson and his family, they don't feel like the typical sort of Southerners we're used to reading about in a lot of fiction. Set, you know, right after the Civil War. You know, they were on the wrong side, right?
Right.
You know, and you have a grandfather who was really active in the Red Strings, you know, an outfit I'd never really heard of in North Carolina after Reconstruction. And he was also really, you know, involved in a place called the Kingdom of the Happy Land around near Tuxedo. I've heard somewhat about that, but talk about, you know, some of that cool stuff that you were able to bring into the book.
Yeah, I was very pleased to be able to work those particular things in there, and not just because I thought they were cool, but also because they informed this particular character. The grandfather in this book is Aurelius Quinn,
Mhm.
and he's a mystery to Carson. And so part of what makes him, he knows his grandfather as his grandfather. He doesn't know his grandfather from his grandfather's past, which was, people talk about, refer to Aurelius as this old hero. Like he made all this difference in before he became a grandfather, right? And so those elements of the Kingdom of the Happy Land, and which is a real place, and the Red Strings, which is a real order that was formed in the Civil War. Basically, what that was a group of North Carolinians who were anti-secession, meaning they were pro-Union, and so they worked behind the scenes to support the Union from inside North Carolina. So it was a fascinating history to me, and that's actually the source of the novel that I'm working on now. And so I'm building that out. Aurelius is a character in that novel.
Oh, cool. So, but it does allow you to sort of delve into race relations. And sometimes it's easy or easy for, I think, a lot of writers to say, well, this is Appalachia. We don't have lots of Black people up here, which is not quite true. You know, or there's always been this stereotype that this is just, you know, white Southerners, white mountain folks here. So it does allow you to sort of, you know, expand that. I mean, even when we're writing histories, you know, it's something about our contemporary time. So talk a little bit about, you know, trying to delve into that area as well in your book.
Yeah, so my goal, one of my goals in writing this was to dispel a lot of the stereotypes and cliches that abound about the Appalachian South, including the lack of diversity. I mean, Appalachia is a very diverse place, and a lot of what we take for granted as being white Southern actually came from African American history, and I wanted that to be present in the book without beating the reader over the head with it. But that's even more so in these other two books this other book that I'm working on, and kind of delving into a little bit more of that history. But it's important, I think, for a writer to try to present, especially a historical writer, to try to present an accurate reflection of the world that existed before, and because that informs the world we live in now.
I do like characters who get obsessed. You know, we met Carolyn very early on, and that experience she had with the ghost. You know, there's a supernatural sort of element in the story. Why is Carolyn so obsessed about finding out the truth? Then Carson, you know, we do find out at the end. No spoilers here, of course, but why is she so obsessed with trying to figure out whether Carson actually did kill his brother or not?
That's a great question, and I think that gets to the sort of the shared history that she and Carson have, even though they live a century apart. They both fall in love with this hollow that's full of hemlocks, and it's very much a spiritual place for both of them. And she recognizes that in Carson, and she recognizes, and she doesn't believe that someone who has that kind of connection to a particular place that she has the same connection to could be a murderer. And so it kind of drives her inward. So her profession is an archaeoastronomer. And so her professional and role is to look outward. And so this gives her the opportunity to kind of look inward. And through piecing together Carson's life, she's sort of looking at her own life in a different way.
And she's got neighbors to contend with. I think that's one of the nice parts is both sides of the story. You know, the past story, Carson's story, Carolyn's story are both fully developed. And Carolyn's trying to renovate this cabin, and she's surrounded by a neighbor who was really concerned about property lines and her trespassing, and not real happy that she's here, because he's been there forever today. And his son Jesse is sort of in the trailer down below from her cabin with some problems with guns and alcohol and drugs and that sort of thing. So, really nice job bringing that. What did you want to do with those characters? Where did they come from?
Well, those characters are descendants of the Duncans, who are the folks that have owned this land for 200 years, and they interact with the Quinn. So this is a family that's interacted with both Caroline, the present, and also with Carson in the past. And so they're kind of a connective tissue between the past and the present. And their relationship to the land is very different than hers. I mean, they own the bulk of the land around this 5 acres that her cabin sits on. And they have, they've planted right in front of her cabin this double wide. And this is that same Hemlock Hollow that Carson fell in love with 100 years before, and that she fell in love with as a child. And all of a sudden, in her mind, it's kind of defaced by this double wide. But she has to learn to accept that, like learning to accept change is one of the themes in the novel.
Yeah. And there's also that nice sort of tension, Appalachia's always had this tension between the natives and the newcomers, century after century after century. I think we're going through that again now, how long have you been here? When did you come here? And how hard it is to find someone whose family has been here for generations now. Those are fewer and far to find. But what's also nice though is that, you give us a sense that, Carson in his voice and in his journal, Carson's a smart guy. Carson reads a lot. So there's a lot of things that he's talking about in the journal that we don't think of as mountaineers, back in that day, thinking about, writing about. Also, we're talking about Darwin, we're talking about Plato and all this stuff that, that Carson likes to read in his grandfather's library. So I take it that you like to read that as well, because Carson gets off some philosophical flights, doesn't he?
Yeah, I'm not nearly as smart as Carson. But yeah, he's like Caroline. He's similar to her, and he ponders the big questions. And he's informed. They're both scientists of sorts, but he's more of a naturalist, and she's more of an archaeologist. But yeah, so he's. I had a fun time getting to know Carson, and through the books that he was reading that would have been available to him at the time. And his grandfather, who was a lawyer, had in his library, and just this, he's fascinated with natural history. He's fascinated with explorers. So he has the works of John Lawson and the Alexander von Humboldt, and all these explorers who they were really popular at the time in the 1880s. This is what people who were dreamers would have read back then.
And I like it. He's going out in the woods and he's giving you the Latin taxonomy of the trees and all that sort of stuff. But it is very much a novel based on place, and it's where you started from your initial inspiration and such. Talk a little bit about place. I mean, what was nice about this book is I felt like I could almost put it in my back pocket, go down to Hickory Nut Gorge, get off the road there, go up the mountain, Rumbling Ball. I mean, you could sort of trace where Carson is going in real life, So how much of that land had you walked over yourself?
A lot. So I grew up, like I said, hiking those trails, hiking really the same hills that Carson and Caroline did. So I'm glad that you could visualize that. I mean, I did throw a little twist here and there and geographically, so that to hide some of the real places. But yeah, Rumbling Ball is there. Round Top Mountain is real. Mountain Blue Rock is real. They're all hopefully appropriately situated in the text.
I think so. And then we do get enough history there. It's like there is the after effects of the Charleston earthquake that Carson sort of feels. Everybody's wondering what's going on. What year was it that Charleston got hit with a really bad earthquake?
1881, I believe.
So, and there is this history and fiction weaving together nicely. And you don't leave, climate change and such out of it. This is still a contemporary novel. So Carolyn, it's not just a romantic vision of things were better back then. Micah, the contractor, comes to Carolyn and says, have you looked at your trees here closely? Your hemlocks, they're all going to die, with this So talk a little bit about, trying to bring in those kind of contemporary issues as well.
Yeah, so it's a real thing that we have to contend with. I mean, obviously, change is constant. And that's a cliche in itself. But Caroline has to manage the hemlock woody adelgid, which has shown up in her hemlock code. And so as a result, she has to remove a number of these trees and that she's known all her life. And in doing so, obviously the hollow changes, and she's not sure if having changed it, having dropped the trees to save the few that were still healthy, like maybe it's not for the worst, she realizes. And so we're always trying to contend with change. And I think Caroline is coming to grips with the fact that change is not always bad, especially when it's related to this hollow.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know that, Cormac McCarthy has a line that, the ugly fact is that books are made out of books. That, you do a lot of research, you do a lot of historical sort of thing, but you also read a lot of fiction, you read a lot of writers. So talk about some of the writers who helped you along the way that you were reading, that, or that you were modeling yourself, because I think every writer, every debut writer stands on the shoulders of lots of writers that come.
Oh, definitely. Yes. So, I mean, you mentioned Ron Rash. Obviously, he's a big influence of mine. I also, my reading was wide at the time when I've been working on this for so long that what I was reading changed drastically from beginning to end. But definitely Barbara Kingsolver is a writer who I've always enjoyed, and her novel Prodigal Summer was definitely an influence. And Lee Smith as well was another author who I read and who really showed how to connect with how to connect history and the current era really well. And then Fred Chappell and Robert Morgan, John Ely.
Oh, yeah. Well, do you have some writers outside the mountains? Because I think a lot of people start reading Kafka, or they become huge Tolstoy fans, or Russians start appealing to them, or whatever.
Yeah, sort of speaking of Russian novelists, the American version of the Russian novelist John Irving was a big influence on me. His novel The World According to Garp was the novel that I read that really made me realize that the writing was a path that could be taken. I read that when I was 17, and I was just enthralled with Garp and his relationship to the written word. And I'm like, oh, okay, so this is possible. Yeah. I thought writers were just sort of born out of a test tube or something. Like they just emerged, fully formed. But
yeah. And Irving is always an interesting fellow to read too, because he's one of the few writers I know of that actually does have his last sentence on the page. I mean, he knows what the last sentence is going to be in the books he writes. I always sort of have to fumble around and stuff. So
I can't imagine doing that.
So anything else you want to talk about here? I'm running, or is there something else you might want to read for us?
Well, I was going to ask you a question.
Okay, sure.
So
go ahead.
We talked about how this is a novel about place, and situated. Both Caroline and Carson are somewhat outsiders, right? Caroline is from the Piedmont, and she's come up here, and she sort of claimed this. Her first memories are in the mountains and of cabin. But you, as a writer who's concerned with place and who's from the mountains, I wondered, how does place hit for you when you're writing a novel that's set in the place where you live? Is it any? I think we were just talking about that, like who belongs?
Who belongs and who doesn't? Well, actually, I grew up in Winston-Salem. But my grandparents were up on the other side of Boone, and there was something, as you say, coming up the mountain, and you're going into a different place. And this was, in the '60s. I'm coming up, to visit my grandparents, and they do live like in a different century or whatever. And you're saying, what's the deal here? They have a television that gets one channel, maybe. My grandfather is a tobacco farmer. He does not have a tractor. He does this with a plow or whatever. I mean, it does feel like a different America. And we go up, and I'd roam around the woods and everything, and it just felt like a different place or whatever. So I think, like you, I was struck by And this is not an unusual sort of thing for people who've come to Asheville. When I was a journalist, over and over and over, when I was interviewing people, I kept hearing I felt drawn to Asheville. You know, I just came here. I mean, it's like this is the summer camp that everybody wants to retire to, right? Or they used to say there was a crystal, right? Back in the New Age, there was a crystal up there beaming at us at Mount Pisgah, you know, all of us there. I mean, there was something magnetic about this view or whatever. So you do wonder about. But I do like stories that do talk about natives and newcomers. You know, who belongs. Whoever shows up belongs in a sense here. I mean, we have to keep reinventing that community, which is very rich ground for writing, you know, novels, right? And for writing fiction, you know, and that kind of those back and forths, you know. What I do like about writing novels is that sort of, you know, get us away from maybe the politics of the day. I don't want to get sucked into the political holes, you know, that I think we are with this country right now, that we're either red or we're blue, or like you're on this team or you're not on that team, something. And sometimes it's fun where you can, not everything has to be seen through that kind of partisan political prism, you know. In the same way that, you know, you have the Duncans, who you could guess who they might vote for, you know, and you could guess for who they, but again, that sort of is so reductive in some sense, and that human beings are more than their party affiliation, who they voted for last time or whatever, which is all that, you know, humans are much more mysterious than that. So that's what kind of fun to explore, not so much good guys and bad guys, but the mixed up humans that we have running around us. So, and I think place becomes important. You know, people don't live in the air, you know, you live somewhere. We happen to live right here, which is a nice place to be. And there's something magnetic about this landscape. I think because, you know, these mountains are so ancient. So this little Facebook meme, you know, the Appalachians are older than the rings of Saturn, right? You know, the river that runs in our backyard is actually older than the mountains,
Right.
You know, and both these mountains and this river go back to the supercontinent Pangea, right? I mean, it just becomes mind-boggling how old and ancient these things are around here. So there are some energies to write about here. So, and I think that's what you do as a novelist, is you're trying to get some energy going on the page. So I know that's when it's a good day writing, when the sentences are starting to sparkle a little bit on the page. So,
Yes.
But anybody who wants to come and write here, they're welcome, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I don't think, you know, you have to be here X number of time, you know, X number of years or anything. And I think also that you don't want to fall into the usual Appalachian stereotypes, which we see so often. Not everybody runs moonshine. Snake handling is a very strange little thing that doesn't happen all the time here, right? Not everybody's sitting on the front porch, you know, they're telling these stories back and forth. It all happens in all sorts of different ways. So working against those stereotypes is always fun. I remember once doing a workshop with John Ely, and John Ely said he did not consider himself an Appalachian writer, for the simple reason that there are no Appalachian readers, right? He wanted to have a universal audience, and so all these people that we're talking about, you know, whether it's Ron or Charles Frazier or Wiley Cash or Lee Smith or King Sullivan, they're writing universal stories that happen to be set in a particular really nice place, you know, part of the world to be in. So that's my take on that.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
So, anything else you want to talk about? I mean, sometimes, you know, these conversations get maybe one-sided. Is there something that someone hasn't asked you? You say, I've been waiting for someone to ask me this.
Well, so where are we in terms of time? So or do we want to open it up for questions?
Yeah, we're about ready for, I think, audience.
Yeah, I mean,
a few minutes here.
That's always interesting to me, is to hear what questions people have. I mean, I know that I could talk all day about my experience of writing the book and what I think it's about. But what I like to hear is what other people who read it think about it and what they think it's about.
Okay, then we can go ahead if you're comfortable
Go
and
ahead, Ed.
open up
Yeah.
for questions. So I'll give primacy. First of all, I see you all too. Don't worry. I see the other side. The others right here. Opening question from the live audience. Why, yes, in the front row.
As a debut novelist, what do you want the reader to take away from this book?
Thank you. That's a great question. The first thing I would like readers to take from the book is entertainment. I mean, it is. I want people to read and enjoy it, and that's what I wanted from the beginning. And it, secondarily to that, I would love it if by reading the book and being entertained by it, it causes you to think about your own places that inform you and how those have changed, maybe your relationship to those places. Because that's really what this book has been for me, is my making sense of a particular place that was really important to me and still is.
Lovely opening question. Would anybody like to take that? Yes, please.
In real life, Culley, were you able to do any investigative work on people who owned the cabin before you? Did that box full of photographs ever leave any history of the cabin for you?
It was dissatisfying. It was not nearly as adventurous, dramatic as what's in the book. So there are no murders and no brotherly spite. But yeah, I think we have pretty good information about the family that built it and why they built it, and sort of the Quinns. The story of the Quinns is likely inspired by that. So it was built by a family for a specific widow to live in that cabin. And she didn't live there for very long. She moved out. It was a little bit cold and far away for her.
My second question, were you ever visited by a fellow in a brown suit while you were?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, so the question was I ever visited by a fellow in a brown suit? And I usually leave this part out. I guess this is just us and no one else is paying any attention to this. Yeah, I had an experience when I was a young boy, similar to what I read actually, of having waking up in the middle of the night and needing to go down to the bathroom and not being able to because someone was on the stairs and they were still on the stairs, and then it got cold and I didn't know what it was. It felt otherworldly. I mean, I'm a skeptic, so I'm disinclined to believe my own thoughts sometimes, but who knows? Who knows? It may have been a sorrowful man in a brown suit.
So if there's any questions from the virtual audience, of course, you can post those in the chat, please, or you can send us your email with your question to virtualqa@malaprops.com. And while we're waiting for those, I think we have some more questions. Yes.
I've heard this book described as a mystery, a love story, a thriller, even horror. I'd like to know where you place it and what other story you compare it to.
Yeah, so the question was that she's heard this story referred to as a thriller, mystery, even horror, and a love story, and what I would call it, and that's so what I call it usually is a mountain mystery. It's a literary historical novel, really. I wouldn't call it horror, but I think, and it's not really a thriller in the sense if you're someone who's picking up a book to be scared or to really a fast-paced read. It's not that, but it's every other thing there. It's a love story. It's a love triangle. It's definitely a mystery. There's a murder at the heart of it. But at the end of the day, I really feel like it's a historical novel.
Yes.
He said that one of the characters, Culley, you're going to carry forward into the book you're writing now.
Mhm.
Do you see yourself creating another kind of yacht with the top or something where the characters keep coming back and talking to you?
Mhm. Yeah.
Can you
So
repeat that?
yes. So Jane asked if I had mentioned that one of the characters is recurring in the work that I'm writing now, and she asked if this was going to continue to be a trend, if there's going to be characters that show up in other works of fiction, the same characters showing up, and that's kind of what I'm working on now. I actually have a completed manuscript that I'm shopping, and I'm working on one, and they're both companion pieces to Hemlock Hollow, and they occur one of them is during the Civil War, about this red string order, and the other one is after the Civil War, sort of tangential to the Happy Land, the Kingdom of the Happy Land. And it's the same characters arrive. The Quinn family, or they may not be the main characters of these other books, but they show up in them, and it's this, same geographical terrain, obviously.
This is a two-part question. I'm dying to know more about the Kingdom of the Happy Land and the red strings. But I also want to know from both of you, and maybe Dale is the one to answer, is how often does a fiction writer also publish works of nonfiction? Perhaps they're not full volumes, maybe they're stories or essays, but it seems like there's probably something in this Red Lines and this Happy Land, pure nonfiction, that would be popular.
Would you mind repeating?
Yeah, so the question is, how often does a novelist also write nonfiction about the topics that they're writing their fiction about, I think. Is that fair? Yeah, and that, I think, I'll be interested to hear what Dale says about this as well. But for me, the history is definitely fascinating to me, and I think that it's important to get that out there. Some of these historical moments we've kind of skipped over in our formal education, I think, especially related to the Civil War and Reconstruction. My interest is telling stories, though, and so I use that to kind of inform the characters that inhabit the world that I'm creating. And I think other people are better equipped to do the nonfiction part. I mean, it's hard for me I've written nonfiction in history, but you're constrained by the facts, and sometimes the facts get in the way of the truth. And what I'm interested in is getting the real, true, the emotional truth of characters who lived in that time. And sometimes that's where my heart lies.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, yeah, it can be done, and there's a few writers I think are brave enough to do that. You think of Robert Morgan and Gap Creek and those early novels, and then you start venturing into writing biographies of Boone and other sort of. The nice thing about Boone is that there's so much legend and stuff around them, and I think it's sort of the temperament of the writer. I'm sort of like Culley. I spend a lot of time in journalism, and journalism is fun, but it's one skill set. Fiction gets to talk about more about the interior of what people are thinking, or what you imagine they're thinking. Because that's the thing, is that we're not mind readers. Historians aren't mind readers. Academics aren't mind readers. Fiction writers are, right? You make it up. What is it like for it to feel this way? So, and that's awfully fun. It's awfully fun. So, but you're right. That is fascinating stuff. I'd like to actually read more about it, but I think Culley's right that this is ripe stuff for fiction coming forward.
Could you tell me 3 things about the Kingdom of Happy Land?
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about this.
Sure. So, and again, this is not my story to tell. I mean, this was a real community that was set up after the Civil War on a plantation south of Asheville. It was on the old Buncombe Turnpike that went from Greenville, Tennessee to Greenville, South Carolina. And right on the border of North Carolina, South Carolina was a plantation called Oakland Plantation. And it was owned by a widow named Sarepta Davis. And after the war, she was there by herself, and the plantation had fallen into disrepair. And there's question about where these folks came from, but a group of former slaves arrived and negotiated with her to occupy that land and to grow, build a community there, and they did that. And they're differing stories. Either they came from the Deep South or they were fairly local. It seems like they actually came up from the Deep South, and they formed this community, and they called it the Kingdom of the Happy Land. And it was actually very, despite being called the kingdom, it was actually very democratic. So everyone had a vote, and they voted for a king and a queen, and they pooled all their resources. They would go out and they would work in the local. There were a series of taverns on that turnpike, and they would go out and work there. They would grow corn that would feed to sell to the drovers that would drive up the turnpike. And so they had a flourishing community. They would pool all their resources into a treasury and share it amongst themselves equally. And eventually they got to the point where they bought the land. So they bought about 180 acres from the widows Repta Davis and built this community. And it thrived for about 40 years after the Civil War. They did things like they had a liniment cream that they manufactured and they sold it in town. They performed. They had a chorus that would travel around and perform. They educated everyone. Everyone learned to read. They were very churchly, so they had church services and went out and proselytized. That they were thriving up until the point that the railroad came in, and so this was based on an economy driven by this turnpike. And when the railroad came in 1879, they lost that source of income, and so after that, the community just dwindled over time. People moved to Hendersonville and Asheville, and up north to the Chicago and Detroit. And then eventually the community got sold. There was one individual that wound up owning it, and they lost it in a legal fight at the end in 1909, I believe. So sorry, that was more than a little bit, but it's a fascinating history, and it's right here. Yeah, yeah. So it shows up in the side in Hemlock Hollow, but I encourage folks to look into it and learn more about it. If you've been to Tuxedo and there's summer camps down there, and one of them, Camp Arrowhead, is kind of close to where that land was. It's still, you can kind of still drive by there and see this road called Kingdom Place, which is, there's not much left.
Other questions?
So you had this multi-year journey to write the manuscript. How difficult was it to deal with publishers to actually get to that point?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So there's one thing to write a book, it's another one to publish it. And so part of the reason that it took a long time is that I would write it. And so my goal was always for publication. Not everyone who writes a book wants to get it published, but that was my goal from the outset. And so my process was to write it, get a draft, get it to where I wanted it, and then send it out to agents. And agents will represent a writer to the publisher. And I wanted to get an agent to do that. And so I would get agents to read it, and they would give me feedback, and then I would revise or not based on their feedback. So and when you have a book that's being read by an agent, you don't really work on it. It's there. They may have it for 6 months. And so I would have these gaps, and then I would get it back, and then I would rewrite it. Ultimately, what happened is I got involved in a writing community called Write-Aways, which is a group run by a friend of ours, Minnie Herman, and her partner, John Ewell, and their guidance editorially really helped me get to a point where I resent it out again, and this time directly to a publisher, Regal House Publishing, and they liked it and picked it up. And so it was so the submitting to publishers and agents was sort of an ongoing process alongside the writing and revising. It informed the revising of it quite a bit.
Let's give a plug to Mimi Herman. Mimi will be here next week here at Malaprops in conversation with Heather Newton. Mimi is publishing her debut novel as well, The Kudzu Queen. So keep an eye out for that. Really enjoyable read.
It is.
Other questions from our live audience? Our virtual audience is a little quiet, a little shy. So to kind of close things out a little bit, could you both talk a little bit about your writing processes? So what's worked? What did you toss out and say, I don't know who gave me that advice, but I'm never doing that again? And how did you persevere through difficult times?
For me, I love writing. And so I think there are a lot of different categories of writers, and you can break it down in different ways. But one of the ways is writers who like to write and writers who like to have written. And I like to write. And so my process is to try to write something a little bit every day. And that's not, obviously that's not always possible, but I enjoy it enough that it's a refuge for me to set aside even just 15 minutes, but hopefully longer, an hour or so, and write on whatever project I'm working on. And I do that whether I'm revising or writing the initial draft.
And how did you get through a difficult time?
Yeah, so the difficult times are every morning. So every time you sit down, you question yourself. You're like, can I do this? You read I read what I wrote before, and I'm like, I don't know if I can replicate that. Or I read what I wrote before, and I'm like, that's crap. I can't, I'm not a good writer. So every time you sit down, it's this question of can I do it? And I think you just, for anyone that wants to be a writer, I think you just have to do it. Like, you just have to tell yourself, what I tell myself is that if I can put one word on the page, then that's enough. You can't write a book in a day. Like, it takes time and it takes effort. And so if I do that, and I seldom when I only write one word, but once I get going, then it feeds itself. And you're always going to revise. You have to revise. So whatever you're putting on the page is going to get changed anyway.
Dale, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I write more often than I don't write, which seems to be helpful. A friend of mine, Rick Boyer, a mystery writer, said, as far as publishing, is that writers succeed who are too stupid to give up. I mean, so Culley and I are not making tons of money at this point, right? So you always hear this unhelpful sort of advice, like what my father says, why don't you write a bestseller like Stephen King? Oh, I wish I had thought of that. So it's like, but I think it is the sort of thing where the best sort of things I've heard is like, writers succeed if they like sentences. Do you like writing sentences? And I like writing sentences, and they start leading somewhere. And I think some of the best advice I heard was from a fellow student at Warren Wilson, who was also like a med student, and she would go on rounds at a hospital and care to patients and that sort of thing. And on her breaks and in between rounds, she carried index cards with her, and she would write a sentence or so. And she went on and became like a medical, doctor, and she became a novelist and published and all that stuff. I say, well, if she can do that, I can't really complain about I don't have enough time. So, which is helpful, And like Culley was saying, is that I don't really feel good about my writing when I look back on it or whatever. Or it doesn't really get easier novel after novel, because you invent one novel and then you sort of say, well, what's next? Or you can't really I can't tell the same story over and over. So it's an ongoing sort of question. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, which is a good place to be in if I think you're a novelist. So it also keeps me out of trouble.
So you say.
Yeah, you can ask my wife.
Okay. And how do you get through a difficult time?
I scream and kick and yell, and the worst time I think I had was like with my first novel that was published, Cow Across America. I remember writing that back in the 90s or so, and I had a IBM hard drive that died, and it took 80 pages of that novel. And there was no backup. It was gone. And I was saying, the gods are telling you something here. This writing, quit now while you're ahead, that sort of thing. Well, you sit down. I sat down with a notebook and pen and started writing in longhand after that. I do back up everything now. But, the writing game is not really easy, and disappointment is always part of it. But that's also part of being human too. I don't know anybody gets through life without some disappointments and such. So it's part of the game.
So just a concluding remark. Go ahead.
Well, Culley, I have had the privilege of already having your book. I've read it page front to back, and I love it. And so now you're on the go. So it's been my privilege to know you and love you, and congratulations.
Thank you.